Hi everyone and welcome to another Squidmar Masterclass. In this video I'm going to take you on a journey and let you as a viewer follow along in the process that goes through my mind as I paint my high-end miniature paint jobs. Because as an artist, when going from a grey miniature to a fully painted one, the path isn't always as straight as we make it seem in some of the step-by-step tutorials that we make, but rather it's a fluid process. So let's start from the beginning and work our way up, this time using the miniature Atle from our miniature series Champions of Sona. We're going to start off by priming the miniature black, bring out your wet palette as well as some finely tipped miniature paint brushes. Personally, I prefer Kolinsky Sable and use our own ones produced by Da Vinci. I'm mainly going to use the medium and the large brush, but pretty much any Kolinsky brand tends to work. For me, and especially on this figure, the skin is the most vital part, as it's not only one of the bigger areas on the miniatures and the focal point, but one of those things that we as humans recognize in an instant. Meaning, if it doesn't look natural, you are going to notice it directly. But also, all of the other parts of the miniature will be colored relatively to the skin tones. And because I think it's the most important part of the miniature, it's important we have that as our baseline when selecting our other colors for the other parts. There's literally as many ways of painting skin as there are painters, but for this paint job I'm thinking of Atle as a barbarian in sort of a desert environment and kind of make the tones feel a little bit like 90% of the skin tones is going to be done using these two colors, Doombull Brown and Cadian Fleshtone. One of my new favorite ways of painting skin is by starting off by really thin down paints and using wet blending. And I know that a lot of people are afraid of using wet blending for fear of messing up. But this is actually going to be one of the most simple ways of getting the skin tones to look correct with as little effort as possible. The plan is to start with Cadian Fleshtone and place that on the areas that are angled upwards towards the light source or the highest raised area on any named surface. We want to paint one area at a time because we need the paint to be moist when we start adding in some of the Doombull Brown. And that is the color that we're going to use on all of the areas that are in most shadow, meaning closest to his cloak on the back, all of the thighs that are angled downwards, the back of his head, the back of his legs, etc. If we have areas that are somewhere in between, on the sides of his legs for example, or more on the side of his torso, we can pre-mix some paints on the palette so we have that ready for when the wet blending begins. And with the first coat, it's going to look quite horrible, but it's going to give us some of the light values that we want to have on the end product, meaning that we can see where the light is going to be brightest, on the center of his chest, on his face, and at the top of his legs. And this is a really good basis. The first layers of wet blending, because we used such a thin color, doesn't fully cover. So I'm going to use the exact same technique again and paint another coat, making sure we get a full coverage this time. And because we already have this basis done with the first coat, we can now be a little bit more careful with our wet blending, making sure we have smooth transitions between the different colors and making sure that we do one area at a time so that the paint is still wet while we're blending between the different layers. And wet blending is one of those techniques that look really scary the first time you try it out. Just make sure that the paint is moist, you have a wet palette with the paints ready so you can move fast. If it's not perfect, it's fine, you can go back and readjust as you go. But if you don't try it out and don't go to the next step in this painting process, you're never going to learn and you're never gonna have this shortcut and easy technique in your arsenal. And with that, we have our base coat down. It is not pretty yet, far from it, but we have a nice base to work from. Now we're going on about the next steps of highlighting, and just like with the base coats going back and forth with the highlights and shadows with the wet blending, there might be a bit of going back and forth to get the right reflections and highlights on the skin as well. In this specific case, I even went back day 2 of painting to do some adjustments on the skin to make it look the way that I really wanted to do. But I'm going a few steps ahead of time. Let's start by adding the colors to the wet palette. Sunny Skintone, Pastel Orange, Light Flesh, and Medium Orange. And of course, the first 2 colors that we used in the previous step. I'm going to start with his right thigh, mixing in some pastel orange together with the Cadian Fleshtone. About 2 parts orange for 3 parts Cadian Fleshtone. We have to think of the general shapes as well as the local shapes. And his thigh has somewhat of a cylindrical shape, and it's angled something like this towards the light source, meaning that the brightest part would be the top of his thigh, angled towards the light. But this big bear of a man also has probably the biggest quads mankind has ever seen. Shaped like 2 baby-sized half melons placed on top of his thighs, meaning that we also got 2 half spheres on top of this cylinder. So we kind of have to highlight them together, but also a little bit separately. I thinned down my paint to something that I would like to call a thin layer consistency. Not quite a glaze, but also not quite layer consistency. And as you can see, this highlight have been added to most of the surfaces. In the center, but also going a little bit up on the muscles of the sides. So once I get that in place, I add a small part of light flesh into that orange Cadian Fleshtone mix. Adding a second highlight in the same area on the same surfaces, meaning at the top part of each one of these quads, but also at the center of the thigh. And as you can see, even as someone that's painted for a long time, we make mistakes. And at this part, I have made something that made the muscles look like lonely islands separated from the muscle going at the center of the thigh. And that is something that I preach that you guys should never do. So we're gonna have to fix that. On the most inner parts of our thigh, we need to connect the muscles on the side to the inner part. Because this part is obviously connected with skin, and the skin would reflect light on all of the area. There's no deep pits on the side of the muscles where all of the light would just be sunken into a dark pit. Everything is the same organ, even if the organ has a different shape on some of the areas. And when I had connected these 2 parts, well, it looked so much better. Here you can see a before and after. Okay, let's move on to the belly, because I think that's a really interesting part to discuss as well. We're going to use the same techniques as we used on the leg, using the same colors. But the most important thing here is not which colors we use, but how we shape the light with the colors. And as a general shape, the body is a flat surface, meaning that if the light is coming from slightly above, it would be slightly brighter at the top and getting a little bit darker the further down we get. And now we need to start thinking locally and not just the general shape. The most important thing, again, similar to with the thigh, is to make it feel like each muscle is covered by skin. Meaning that we connect each muscle on the abs together with the skin in between the abs. Starting with highlighting them locally on top of each one of his 6 packs. And then once that is done, making sure that we highlight the center of each one of these muscles. And while we do that, let me talk about this week's sponsor, Squarespace. Does any one of you make art or do something cool that you want to display online? Well, Squarespace is a one-stop shop for you. Whether you want to display your art on an epic gallery or sell a cool product, they have some of the coolest award-winning templates on the internet. And the best thing is, it is so freaking easy to use. You got so many cool designs to pick from, and it's pretty much just drag and drop to make it feel like your own unique website. And when I say an easy shop to handle, I truly mean that, because I've tried publishing STL files to sell on their platform, and it was so freaking easy. And if you want want to sell a physical product like we've also done, it's just as simple. And my recommendation is to just try it out for free. You can follow the link down below in the video description. Build your own website, and once you're ready to launch, you just use the code Squidmar to get 10% off your entire purchase of a website or a domain. There's never been an easier time to make your own website to display what you do online. Now, let's get back to talking more about the skin. And the same thing goes for highlighting the areas between the muscles, because we have to think of how light bounces. So whether you have a concave or convex shape, they both reflect as much light, meaning that this would be like the six-pack reflecting light because it's bent outwards. The areas that are in here reflects just as much light, meaning this is the area in between the muscles. The only parts that wouldn't be reflecting as much light are the parts underneath the muscles. On the face, we're going to repeat the exact same techniques, leaving everything angled downwards, like on the neck and underneath the eyebrows, darker, and then keeping it brighter at the very top of the face, on the top of the nose and the cheekbones. Now we have all of the highlights in place. It's time to make the first general adjustments, because I wasn't 100% satisfied with the color tone of the skin. I wanted it to feel warmer, like he'd been out in the sun more. So I brought out some AK Interactive 3rd generation medium orange and thinned it down to a proper glaze, meaning it's super thin down, it's only going to work as sort of a color filter. And it's honestly so thin down that a Games Workshop wash would by comparison feel like a base texture paint. It's really thin down. I then add this, mainly focusing on the shadow areas as well as the midtones, leaving the highlights the way they already are. With one exception, on the top of his right thigh, I added it like a super thin filter, even thinner than on the other parts. And it just gave it a little hint of more warmth. And this is what I mean with the paint process being a fluid journey. Things might change. You might find out that once you've got the entire skin painted, you feel like it's not warm enough. And if you figure out what the problem is, you can with small adjustments make it feel the way that you want it to be. And this to me made all of the difference in the world. With that thin layer of orange, I felt super happy with how the skin looked. Time for the pretty fur around his neck and all of the fur on the rest of his body. I want these areas to be kind of neutral, so I don't want a super saturated color. I still want to help to draw some of that focus to his face, so I want to leave it a little bit brighter up here than I do on the bottom part of the fur. And if we want to add more saturation or anything like that in the end, we can add that at a later step of the painting process. But for now, I'm thinking this as sort of a brown bearish fur, so I'm going to leave it quite saturated, dark brown grayish. So I'm going to start with my favorite dark brown color, Rhinox hide. I will be painting in Rhinox hide in all of the shadow areas, covering pretty much 40% of the piece, and wet blending that together with the color Gorthor brown in all of our highlight areas. That will be about the remaining 60%. But of course, we're going to have some transitions between the dark and the brighter color, so giving you an exact percentage is not really going to help you. Doing this blend means that our shadows now in the brightest areas will have Gorthor brown, which means that even the shadows in the brighter areas will be brighter than in the darker areas. As opposed to having the same shadow color on all of the areas, that would make it look a little bit more cartoony. Once it's time to start highlighting this fur, we're going to mix 50-50 Gorthor brown together with Rakarth flesh. When you have a fur that is as well designed as this one, it will almost paint itself. Because the fur is split up in different sections, and for each one of these sections we want to make sure that the highlight goes all the way up to the one section that is above it. And then going down with the highlight about 50% down of each one of these sections. Again, remember to make sure that the highlight goes all the way up to the edge above it. Once we got that in place in all of the areas that were base coated with Gorthor brown, we can now move on to the last highlight. We're going to use a clean Rakarth flesh and add that to about 50% of the area we previously covered with Gorthor brown. There's a lot of paint words being thrown around here, but to make it simple, about 30% of the fur will now be covered with just clean Rakarth flesh. And this time, for each section, we place the highlight at the top, only about 30% of each of these sections. And with that, we should have a really nice looking fur. We now just gotta repeat the exact same process on all of the other fur parts, on his arm, around his belt, as well as on the legs. And with all of the fur done, let's move on to the reddish cloak. A lot of the techniques we use in this painting process are reused on all of the parts, and the cloak is no exception. I'm adding the paints Rhinox hide, scarlet red, as well as black on the wet palette. And for this part, we don't need to place all of the highlights exactly perfect in the beginning because we're going to add a lot of that placement with our highlights in a later step. Now it's more about getting the volumes right and getting an estimated understanding on where the light is going to be. All of the flat areas angled upwards will be painted with scarlet red, like the bottom of his cloak and the part that is resting on his arm and leg. While these areas are still wet, we blend in some Rhinox hide to all of the areas angled completely to the side, and then mix between these colors so we get a nice transition between the highlight color and the shadow color. On the area directly under his shield, I'm going to mix in some black and then blend that down to Rhinox hide to finally come down to the scarlet red. This creates a feeling that the shield is casting a shadow onto the cloak, meaning that it's darker directly underneath it where the light wouldn't be bouncing as much. Just like when you're painting the skin, sometimes you have to do 2 laps of wet blending to get a full coverage. That is totally normal. Don't worry if it doesn't look perfect, again, because a lot of the things that make it look awesome is done with the highlight layers. So if it's not a perfect blend, don't worry. And speaking of highlights, it's now time to highlight with the first layer. I'm going to be using a technique called stippling. This pretty much means that I'm adding tiny dots of a brighter color on top of this red. And I'm mixing about 2 parts scarlet red to 1 part light flesh. Because if I add too much light flesh on a too big of a surface, the cloak is going to feel more pink than red. So I want to start slow and then build our way up. We stipple carefully, making sure that we don't cover too large of a surface. Any area that is angled upwards, I will highlight, covering maybe 20 to 40% of this area. And when highlighting cloaks, make sure that you don't just highlight the convex shapes of the cloak, because just like with skin, you will have just as much light bouncing on the inner folds of the cloak as you will on the outer folds. And if you want to highlight any of the darker parts, like the inner folds at the top here, then you can just use a clean scarlet red as your brightest highlight color. Since I'm adding this highlight with a quite thin down paint, on the most raised areas, the top 10% of each one of these folds, I want to add another coat using the same blend as we did the first time. This is to create a nice transition from the scarlet red to a fully covering scarlet red / light flesh mix. Just remember, for each layer you add it to a slightly smaller surface than the previous one. And once the cloak is done, it should look something like this. There's a few parts on this miniature that don't need a lot of attention, and we kind of want to keep them desaturated and not as contrasty as the parts around his face and the weapon. So I'm going to reuse the same colors as we used on the fur. And one of those parts is the fabric just beneath the fur on the legs. I'm going to base coat these using Rhinox hide. The main difference here is that when I'm highlighting now, I'm using Gorthor brown as our main highlight, similar to what we did on the shadows of the fur. I'm using the stippling technique that we used on the fabric of the cloak, and just stippling in highlights on the top part of each of these folds on the fabric. If you want to, you can blend in a tiny bit of Rakarth flesh, adding a little bit of highlight, but again, remember, we want this area to be less vibrant to take less focus from the other parts of the mini. Now we're heading into painting a fun part. These are the bones and skulls of the mini, and there's a lot of them, as there should be when you're painting a barbarian. We're going to be using 3 colors for all of the bony parts, and we're going to purposefully paint him kind of desaturated and boring, and then bring in more life to the bone at the end of the painting process. So please be a little patient if you don't feel like it's looking awesome already at this stage, but it will do at the end. I'm adding Steel Legion Drab and Light Flesh to the wet palette. Firstly, covering all of the bone parts with a thinned down Steel Legion Drab. I'm then mixing in about 30% light flesh into the Steel Legion Drab for the first highlight. I'm going to highlight the bones in a few different ways, so bear with me. The big thing is to highlight most of the bone parts using the techniques we've used previously, placing most of the highlights at the top part and the raised areas, such as these hip bone parts and the skull of the head. All of these areas are highlighted like spheres on the top, meaning that they are almost like a ball and would have a highlight that's circular at the top of each part. All of the flat areas like the eye sockets are highlighted like flat surfaces and highlighted fully. On the horns though, we do want to add some more interest, making these kind of spider webbing-like patterns, pulling the brush in the same direction for each stroke and making them almost like hourglass-shaped highlights. And pulling the brush in the same direction does a ton to add texture, and texture is something that we want to have on a miniature of this scale. Now it's time for our second highlight. We're using the same two colors, but this time using about 70% light flesh and 30% Steel Legion Drab. We're adding the highlight to the exact same surface, this time using a slightly smaller area, meaning that we go from Steel Legion Drab to a slightly brighter Steel Legion Drab to a lot brighter, and we get a nice transition and your eyes will fill out the blends between these two different highlights. On some areas we can also blend in more different types of techniques, maybe adding some stippling on the top to get more texture, maybe even adding a little bit more light flesh into some of the areas to create more patterns, scratches, and micro textures like that. Just remember to follow the volumes and highlight it perpendicularly so that the brightest point is the one that is closest to the light source, meaning the sun. And I think with that, we're calling all of the bony parts highlighted done at this step, and we'll come back to them later. It's time to paint some beard. We're going to reuse some of the paints we've used previously. Base coating the entire thing is sandy dust. And any part angled downwards, I'm adding a little bit of Steel Legion Drab to get some more shadow. Once that is done, we're going to bring in our first highlight, a mix between the two colors Sand Yellow and Sandy Dust. I'm creating a highlight along the curve of his hair, as if the hair is reflecting the light and bouncing on the left side of his hair wave. And on the right side of his hair, we're going to place the highlight on the very top, meaning that the highlight is all the way up to the edge of the hair wave that's going in this direction. As a final highlight, I'm going to paint in some very fine strands to get some texture. Following the same areas as our previous highlight, I'm mixing in a dab of pale sand to our previous paint mix. This time I'm using a smaller brush with a very fine tip. And if you've never tried a Kolinsky brush before, this is the time, because when you do fine details like this, you're gonna get such a nice flow. I try to touch with just the very tip of the brush onto the hair and making small downwards brush strokes. And once the hair is done, we can go repeat the exact same process on his beard and mustache. It is time to finally paint some steel. And all of the steel on this figure is going to be highlighted using the same colors. So I'll start off with the ones on his feet, and then we'll repeat the exact same process on all of the other parts so you can see how I do that. We're using 3 paints for the steel parts: Vallejo model color black, Rakarth flesh, as well as ice yellow. We're going to start off by blocking out our lights. I'm mixing in about 50-50 black with Rakarth flesh. And for each one of these metal parts, we want to have 1 or 2 or 3 highlight reflections. We're going to start off by placing out our first main highlight. And this area should be the one that is angled towards the light source and cover about 25% of the area. Again, I'm painting everything using the same direction of the strokes to get some texture. It is important to leave the bottom edges of all of these panels black, because when we paint non-metallic metal, getting some separation between the different panels, it is what's going to sell the effect of it being something that is really truly metallic. I then use the exact same colors and start adding in secondary and tertiary reflections. This is super important. If you only use one highlight when painting metal, it is going to look really fake, so make sure that we have at least 2 or 3 different highlights so that it feels like light is bouncing from all over. As a second highlight, we're going to add a clean Rakarth flesh. This highlight will not be added to all of the areas, because we want the light to be bouncing more from the top 2 reflections and not as much on the bottom ones. But one thing we can do now is to connect the different highlight parts added using sort of an edge highlight on the very inner part of the panels and the very outer part of the panel. We're going to finish that off with a third highlight, adding some sun yellow to the Rakarth flesh, and just on the center highlight. And this is added to an even smaller surface, meaning that we have 3 different brightness of the highlights, and each highlight is highlighted in 1 or 2 or 3 different steps, to give these nice smooth transitions and always using brush strokes in the same direction. If you want to go nuts, you can take a really thin down sun yellow and just add a tiny dot of that at the very top of the top panel. But if you add too much, it is going to look fake, so be very careful and sparing using a clean sun yellow on the metal. On my figure, I felt like I went a little bit too far with the sun yellow, so we're going to have to glaze it down a little bit again. This is one of those things that you just notice as you're painting. Not something that you can foresee and add steps for before you're actually painting the figure. So I thinned down some black and made a really dark glaze that I glazed down on the side of each one of these panels. And with that, you should have something that looks quite awesome. We can now repeat the exact same process on the metal thing that is holding the tassel on his shield. We have to consider what shape we have this time. The top of it kind of feels sphere-like, meaning that we create a circular highlight at the top. On the side of it though, it's more like a cylinder, meaning that we want the light to reflect alongside of the cylinder. And I'm probably going to add 2 or 3 highlights on this part, using the exact same techniques, going to Rakarth flesh and then to sun yellow. And remember to connect the different parts using an edge highlight on the different raised areas. And when highlighting the different rivets, we make sure that just the center one is the brightest one, going all the way up to sun yellow, and the ones on the side are slightly darker. We can now repeat the exact same process on the sword and the shield, starting with the sword. Similarly to when I'm painting the flat side of the sword, I'm going to do the same thing on the rim of the shield. It's just the very top edge of it that I'm going to highlight with sun yellow, and while the back of the shield and the rims there are not getting as much light as the light is coming from the front. So I'm not highlighting it quite as bright, and this time I'm also using a thinner brush with a fine tip, creating some scratches going in from the side on each of these rims to make sure that it feels like it's been used, worn, and hit by other weapons during battles previously. We're also going to shade this a little bit later, so it's quite okay if everything has the same brightness on all of the parts around the shield, but this is just how I paint it. And all of the top parts of the patterns on the back of the shield and the rims, we make sure that these are highlighted with an edge highlight. We don't have to edge highlight the whole thing, but adding some dots of ice yellow with the tip of the brush to get some edge reflections really makes a huge difference. And the back of the shield is covered in wooden planks, and this as well as the ropes need to be separated from one another. And this part is, I'm assuming, a dark grayish brown, but I still want it to be separated from the rope as well as the teeth that we've already painted on the back. And how do we do that? Well, it requires 3 steps. The first one, I'm bringing out the brown sand, thinning it down and painting with the finest tipped brush that I have in my collection. Painting in different grains and patterns using the very finest tip of the brush. Once that is done, we add a second highlight, using some ice yellow and brown sand on just the very top parts of some of these strands. I think I'm adding 2 or 3 different highlighted strands at the top, and that should be enough for now. The second part of separating this from the other stuff comes at the end of the painting process. There's a few smaller but yet so important steps left to do on the miniature. Some of those are rope and leather. Even though all of these parts are going to be different shades of browns, we want to make sure that they are separated from one another and look differently, both in light values but also in saturation and hues. Especially since we already have a bunch of parts of the miniatures like the bones and skulls that are some form of brownish sand tone, as well as the fur parts that are brown. Let's start with some simple ones. We got his shoes, the belt that goes over his chest, as well as some of the leather straps on his weapon. I'm going to base coat all of these using Rhinox hide. And then go in with one of my favorite Citadel colors, Doombull brown. On the shoes, we're stippling this on the top part of the shoe. On the leather strap, I'm using a downwards motion on the paintbrush on some of the areas. The second highlight we're going to add is Mournfang brown. It is a little bit more of an orange leather tone than the Doombull brown, and this time we add it to a lot smaller surface, something like maybe 20-30% of the leather straps and the shoes. I'm using stippling on the shoes again, and on the leather straps using the downward stroke motion. It's time for our third highlight, and leather does require a lot of layering to make it look good and natural. I'm adding in some Deathclaw Brown, this time on an even smaller surface than the previous highlight. This time it's about 10% of the areas. Focusing on the very edge of the leather straps, using stippling again and the downwards brush strokes. On the shoes we can be even more sparingly, because we don't want the shoes to take any of the focus from any of the other parts. As a final thing on the leather straps, on the very edges I'm going to stipple in a few dots of sunny skin tone. Again, use this very sparingly and on just a few of the surfaces. On the leather strap I do it on the very top of his chest. And on the part that goes over the skull, it is on the bent area in the very center of that curve. On the back of the miniature we have a nice looking rope, and we want this one to look brownish as well, but this time going more towards sort of a sand beige tone. So I'm using an orange brown from Vallejo and mixing that with black. On the parts of the rope that are angled downwards we're using this orange black mix, and on the top half of the rope I'm using a clean orange brown. For our first highlight we're mixing a 50-50 mix of orange brown and Iraqi sand, adding it to every single strand of the rope. Not to the most raised areas of these strands, but rather in the folds of the rope, and then highlighting the whole flat surface that is pointing upwards. For our second highlight though, going in with the clean Iraqi sand, I'm only adding this to the top half of the strands, making sure that the bottom part of the rope is slightly darker than the top. As a final highlight we can mix in about 50% ice yellow to the Iraqi sand, and that should be enough, adding that to maybe just the top 4 or 5 strands of the rope, giving us a nice transition from the bright at the top to the dark at the bottom. I'm now going to use the exact same colors to paint the leather on the handle of the sword. This will also create a nice separation from the leather a bit further down on the weapon as opposed to this one on the top. Starting off with black and orange brown. Instead of highlighting with Iraqi sand, I'm going to mix in some sunny skin tone to the orange brown. About 2 parts orange brown to 1 part sunny skin tone. I don't want to push this leather all the way up to sunny skin tone, because this is again one of those parts that we don't want taking focus from the face. We're now heading into the last step using the regular paintbrush, and this is the base. I'm reusing 2 of the colors we used for the leather, Doombull brown, together with the orange brown. I'm starting off by basing the entire rock using a very thin down Doombull brown. While this is still wet, I'm going in with the same orange brown that we used on the leather and painting that on all of the areas that is upwards towards the sun. And this includes all of the sideways going ledges on the side of the rock. Once we got this wet blend in place, it's time to bring in some highlights. We don't have to highlight this in many different steps. You can add either Iraqi sand or the sunny skin tone, whichever you prefer. Mixing that with the orange brown should give you a nice highlight. And this time we're not using a specific brush stroke or wet blending in the highlights or dry brushing in the highlights, but rather going in with different types of random controlled chaos brush strokes. Mixing stippling with dragging the brush, just as long as we make sure that we get some separation between all of the sides that are angled downwards on the rock to the ones that are flat angled upwards. And you might notice that on this specific paint job I made sure that I had the most light around this area and kept it purposefully darker down here, just adding the final highlights up here on this edge and leaving this down here with the wet blend that we had from the first coat. We're nearing the light at the end of the tunnel, but there is one super important step left to do. And for this part, we're going to need an airbrush, or rather, it's going to be a lot easier for you if you use the airbrush. If you don't have an airbrush, you can just thin down the paints that we're using and glazing them into all of the areas that I'm spraying with the airbrush. With the difference being, you have to be careful adding it to every single area, whilst with the airbrush we can shade and shape the miniature generally with a single airbrush stroke. I start out by bringing out the airbrush, adding a few drops of P3 brown ink to the airbrush, thinning it down about 1:1 with airbrush thinner. I'm using this on all of the skin and fur and leather parts, spraying from a downwards angle into all of the areas where I want to have more shadow and a little bit more saturation. When I'm spraying on the brown leather parts and the fur on his hands, I make sure that I cover it up with something like a piece of paper so we don't get it leaking into the highlights of the skin. If we do, it's not the end of the world, but that would mean that we have to repaint some of the skin. I'm adding a little bit extra of this on the bottom part of his legs, as well as the side of his belly, to get more of that dark brownish shadow tone where we don't have as much light hitting. I'm also spraying a little bit of this on some of the metal parts. Namely the ones that are down at the bottom of the miniature, like the bottom part of his sword, as well as the bottom part of the metal plates on his feet. With this I can create a nice reflection, making it feel like the metal is reflecting the environment that he's in. I also spray a little bit of this on one of the buckles on his belt. And having this dark brown, very saturated ink as sort of a reoccurring color, being part of the shadows on most of the parts of the miniature, really brings everything together by a wide margin. And it helps create some separation on some of the parts of the big skull, meaning that we get some nice separation between the horns on the top and the main part of the skull. And the final thing that I'm painting with the brown ink is the back of the shield. And whenever I'm spraying in shadows like this to bring in volumes and shape the light of the miniature, it is so important to use the finest movements of your finger. Once I have the trigger pushed down to release air, I just move it backwards in a minuscule motion to make sure that I just release a tiny bit of paint, so I don't add too much of this ink. Just a little bit at a time, and maybe put the miniature away for a bit so I can come back and look at it to make sure I haven't overdone it. Because if you overdo it at this step, it's going to look a little bit fake, so we just want to add a little bit at a time until we reach a perfect point. Once all of the brown is sprayed, I clean up the airbrush and add green yellow. The reason for this, I want to add some more color, but I don't want it to take over. And the green complements the red and brown tones really well on this piece. So I'm just thinning it down by a lot, using 3 parts thinner to 1 part paint. And then glazing with the airbrush on some parts of the skull, some parts of the metal, to make it feel like it's reflecting some form of light from elsewhere. That isn't just a cold steel color. And on the skull, maybe it's some form of algae starting to grow. And again, don't overdo this, I'm just adding it a little bit to get some form of extra tones into the piece. And as a last step on the airbrush, I'm using Vallejo black. Thinning it down a lot, like a lot. I think it's 5 or 6 parts thinner to every part black, because once we use this through the airbrush, if we paint with too thick of a coat, we're going to remove all of the things that we've added previously. And this black I'm adding on 2 specific areas. The first one being the bottom part of the skull and the eye sockets of the skull. This again to create even more volume and make it feel less pale whitish. The other part is the shield. So I'm going to use this thin down black and shade it to all of the bottom part of each rim, as well as the metal patterns on the shield. And finally, on the bottom quarter, with a tiny bit of thin down black. And with that, we've created a nice transition going from brighter wood to darker wood, while still keeping all of those wood grains that we painted in the first step of the wood. So there's 2 tiny steps left on the miniature, and after that, you're gonna be done. The first one, I want to add some more focus to the sword. I'm going to create a super simple orange glow from some of these runes. Starting out by painting with the white in the center of these runes. Then going over with the airbrush doing the exact same thing with a thin down white. Once that is done, we can spray with a thin down orange fluorescent color, or whichever one you prefer. Just make sure that you don't add too thick of a coat, because then it's going to look fake. So I'm just adding a thin one so it doesn't take all of the focus on the miniature. We still have to remember that he's out in the daylight, so if it's too orange, too poppy, it's gonna feel weird. If you want to take it a step further, you can thin down some of that ice yellow and add it to the core of the orange. If not, you can just leave it as it is. The other last thing we're going to do is to make the final cleanup. This is one of those things that you don't really know if you're gonna have to do until the miniature is finished. For me, there were a few parts that needed cleanup. For one, some of the parts from the airbrushing, because we get a little bit of an overspray. Some of them because we figured out things along the way that needs highlighting or cleaning up. Let's start with those metal parts that we sprayed with some of that brown ink. At the bottom part of the sword, I'm using the same highlight colors, creating new reflections in a similar fashion that we did previously with the steel color, but now with the brown sand colors. So I'm just adding this to the bottom quarter of the sword, and it makes a huge difference. Really makes it feel like now it's part of the environment as opposed to just being a brownish sword bottom. You can also add that to the bottom parts of the shoe metal panels. The other thing is some of the final highlights that we had added previously with the ice yellow on the metal, maybe some of that sunny skin tone on the leather, have vanished from the airbrush work. So I'm going in with the same colors that we used before on the metal, using ice yellow on some of these buckles on the belt, using some of the sunny skin tones on the leather, and maybe some pale flesh on all of the bone parts. Just pushing that highlight an extra step. Since I also sprayed some of this brown ink on the fur, I went back in with some of the pale flesh Rakarth flesh to add in the final highlights again. Especially around the face area, we really want that to pop. And my final step is just going in, cleaning up some of the face work. Using sunny skin tone, I'm adding a little bit of an extra highlight to the muscles on his forehead. Adding these final highlight, these extra details, is really what makes my miniature go from a 9 to a 10, at least in my skill range. If you missed any parts or forgot to paint any parts, this is the time when you go back and fix that. But for now, I feel like I'm done. And with that, we have an end result that looks like this. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to have the miniature, again, remember we put all of that as well as the paints and the brushes we used in the video description. Massive thanks to all of the patrons. It is thanks to you guys that we can publish these videos for free on the channel and don't have to charge a single dollar for them and still be able to have a normal salary. So awesome. Thank you so much. And on a final note, thanks to this week's sponsor. And with that, have a good day. Bye bye.